is Britain's most famous monarch. King Arthur, legendary commander of the Knights of the Round Table. Armed with the mighty sword Excalibur.
We'll never tire from hearing the stories of King Arthur.
His name is a byword for honor and courage.
He's a legendary figure, a war leader par excellence.
In the 20th century, two archaeologists set out in search of King Arthur's bones. One was a scientist driven by the facts, who risked ridicule and isolation in his quest.
Here is a man that flies in the face of received wisdom.
The other was obsessed by the supernatural.
What Bligh was doing was increasingly odd.
It was a journey that took them into the darkest part of England's dark Middle Ages. This is the story of the quest for King Arthur's grave. King Arthur is one of the most famous characters in the history of the British Isles. According to legend, his spectacular reign dates to the 6th century AD.
The popular image of King Arthur is of a knight in shining armour with a round table, heroic knights who go on quests, especially for the Holy Grail.
King Arthur is truly the stuff of legend. There's the famous story of the young Arthur drawing the sword from the stone, and his many magical adventures with the wizard Merlin. But the real King Arthur is shrouded in mystery, because the 6th century was at the heart of the Dark Ages. Few facts about this period of history are known. The peoples of Britain were under attack by foreign invaders. According to legend, King Arthur was their defender and champion. But his story ends with a valiant death in battle.
Arthur wins a whole series of battles before being fatally wounded in a climactic last battle with his arch-enemy.
Arthur is mortally wounded, and he's then taken to the Isle of Avalon to be healed of his wounds. And that's the last we hear of him.
The Isle of Avalon was the greatest mystery of all. No one knew where Arthur's last resting place actually was.
Fantasy, myths, ancient beginnings. Elevate your historical exploration to unparalleled heights with a History Hits subscription. Don't miss out on our latest releases, where classicist Natalie Haynes travels to Corfu to unravel the story of the Gorgon Medusa, one of the most iconic yet misconstrued figures of Greek mythology. Join Jasmine Elmer as she dives into something that people have been obsessed with throughout history: dragons. Where did they come from? What exactly is a dragon? Finally, Dan Snow explores the ancient history of the Isles of Scilly and discovers burial grounds built thousands of years ago. Discover hundreds of hours of award-winning documentaries and ad-free podcasts with History Hit. Sign up for a special offer via the link in the description.
I think most contemporary scholars would doubt that in historical terms there ever was an Avalon.
But in 1191, 600 years after Arthur's death, the monks of Glastonbury Abbey in the west of England made a stunning discovery. They found King Arthur's grave.
This must have been one of the most celebrated discoveries, well, was the most celebrated discovery of the Middle Ages.
The grave contained a lead cross, identifying the bones as King Arthur's.
When they came to look at the inscription on the lead cross, they read it as saying, "Here lies buried the famous King Arthur in the Isle of Avalon."
The monks of Glastonbury believed their own abbey was Avalon itself. The mystery of King Arthur's death seemed to be solved.
There really was a King Arthur. We've got his tomb exactly in the same way as we've got the tombs of other famous kings.
But for modern historians, it was impossible to tell whether the monk's story was true. Because in 1539, Glastonbury Abbey was totally destroyed by Henry VIII in his power struggles with the Catholic Church. All traces of King Arthur, his bones, and the cross that marked his grave were apparently lost. By the 20th century, scholars were left with no hard evidence that there ever was a real King Arthur.
There's a lot of scepticism about whether King Arthur really existed or did any of the things ascribed to him.
There is nothing that would confirm the existence of a historical figure called Arthur.
But in 1908, there was one man who firmly believed that King Arthur was real. And not only that, he set out to prove it. The brilliant architect, Frederick Bligh Bond, believed that only he could track down King Arthur's last resting place, somewhere in the shattered ruins of Glastonbury Abbey.
The only way we can actually prove whether King Arthur existed, or indeed disprove it, is by tangible archaeological remains.
If you could find a fragment of Arthur's tomb, then your reputation as an archaeologist would be made.
Bligh Bond convinced the Abbey's owners, the Church of England, to allow him access to Glastonbury. But he would still have to prove his credentials.
I think this was too good an opportunity for him to miss. Here was this almost virgin site, remarkably little work is done on it. He's the man to step forward.
In the early 1900s, the science of archaeology was in its infancy. Bligh Bond would use his architectural skills to make the first systematic search of Glastonbury Abbey. But only a few ruined walls remained. So the first step in Bligh Bond's quest was to fill in the gaps, to make a detailed plan of the Abbey as it once was.
Bond is, in effect, making a map. He actually stayed on site each day. He took measured drawings of what was found. Now this, of course, sounds very, very basic to our ears today, but this was something that most of his contemporaries simply didn't do.
The magnificent Abbey had several major buildings, but if Bligh Bond could map them out, then the historical records gave him a tantalizing clue where Arthur's bones could be found. After finding the grave, the monks had been anxious to display Arthur's remains to important visitors. So they put them in pride of place at the centre of their largest and most important building, the Abbey Church.
They were brought out in 1278 to be presented to two very interested visitors indeed, King Edward I and his wife, Queen Eleanor of Castile. So they paid for a tomb of black marble to be set out in the middle of the Abbey Church.
The story should have led Bligh Bond straight to King Arthur's tomb. But with the entire site in ruins, the location of the Abbey Church was far from clear. Bligh Bond's problem was to somehow map out its missing walls, then find the tomb at the centre. And to find the solution, he would rely on his lifelong fascination with mathematics.
his first love really is mathematics, and especially mathematical puzzles, numbers, correspondences.
Bligh Bond believed the builders of Glastonbury Abbey had used a secret mathematical code. His measurements showed that the layout of the abbey followed a deliberate number pattern. It had been handed down by architects since biblical times.
According to his measurements, there seemed to be repeating numbers and patterns which were coming out, and these were more than coincidental, but seemed to be a foundation plan, a foundation geometry.
Bligh Bond knew that ancient builders often used number patterns called magic squares. Every square has 6 rows and 6 columns. But to crack the code, Bligh Bond had to find a way to fill in the rows and columns so that they all added up to the same number. He made hundreds of attempts to find the right pattern, until finally he had the solution. The secret magic number was 111. Bligh Bond was convinced that he knew what it meant. 111 multiplied by 8 makes 888 inches, or 74 feet. He believed he had discovered the secret. The ancient builders had laid out the abbey on a grid of 74-foot squares.
Bligh comes to the conclusion that he's discovered the medieval laying out plan of Glastonbury Abbey.
Bligh Bond decided to prove his credentials by putting his map to the test. He would reveal the Abbey's lost buildings one by one. Acting on his instructions, his workers dug a trench exactly 74 feet long. They immediately hit the foundation stones of an entire chapel that no one else knew was there. It had been missing for nearly 400 years. But Bligh Bond's map had predicted its location. The lost chapel exactly filled the last square of 74 feet.
Bond called it the Lost Chapel because it was the only significant addition to the abbey of which there was no surviving trace. Nothing remained above ground. It was something of a test for Bligh, if you like.
One of England's greatest archaeologists said the Lost Chapel had never even existed. But Bligh Bond uncovered it within weeks. He had even predicted its eventual size.
Bond hit foundations, followed them to the east, and discovered a very large 4-bay building, thus proving one of the leading archaeologists of the day wrong.
The church authorities were dazzled. This was a man who could predict exactly what he would find before he even started digging.
The discovery of the Lost Chapel, if you like, very clearly marked Bond out as an archaeological force to be reckoned with. Large numbers of visitors came to the Abbey, including people like the Bishop of Bristol, who even commented, "How are you doing it? You know, you don't seem to be wasting a spadeful of earth."
The Lost Chapel was the first square to be filled in on Bligh Bond's 74-foot grid pattern. His excavations soon revealed that the much larger Abbey church, the last known location of King Arthur's tomb, was also a perfect fit to his master plan. The huge building was 1 square wide and 5 squares long. Bligh Bond knew exactly where to dig for Arthur's bones, right in the center of the church.
When he's got all that information, then he measures out on the ground and puts his spade into the turf.
If Bleibond's calculations were correct, then the marble tomb was about to be revealed. And he soon found what he was looking for. Telltale chippings of the distinctive black stone. These were the last remnants of the tomb which had been smashed by King Henry VIII in 1539. If Arthur's remains had also survived, they had to be somewhere nearby. But to Bleibond's utter disbelief, his workers couldn't find a single fragment of bone. For all his ingenuity, Bleibond's search for King Arthur had failed. And at this major setback, his church paymasters started to question his strange obsession with numbers.
There was nothing fundamentally unorthodox about what Bond was doing with number at all. It was just highly unusual.
To the church establishment, magic squares looked like numerology. A practice they connected with the paranormal, even Satanism.
It all sounded extremely dubious. Eyebrows were raised, questions were asked at committee meetings.
The church's patience was running out, and Bleibond needed results, fast. His new plan was to look for the actual grave where the 12th century monks had found King Arthur's remains. It would be one last chance to find any bones the monks had left behind. But Bleibond's map was now useless. The grave could be anywhere in the abbey's grounds. A total area of 220,000 square feet. To track it down, Bleibond was ready for desperate measures.
Bligh is so convinced by his work with symbolic number, and he so desperately wants this to be true that he oversteps the mark.
Bleibond turned to the occult. With the help of a psychic named John Bartlett, Bond planned to communicate with the dead. Their seances used the paranormal technique of automatic writing.
They would take out a couple of sheets of clean white paper, they would sit down comfortably, and they would either ask a question into the air or alternatively write a question at the top of a piece of paper. Bartlett would put a pencil in his hand and put his hand on the sheet of paper. Bligh would then take his right hand and put it on Bartlett's left hand in which he was holding the pencil. And after a few hesitant movements, Bartlett's hand would start to write, and scrawl would proceed across the page.
The writing seemed to be guided by an unseen power. For Bleibond, it was electrifying. The monks of the ancient abbey were telling him their secrets.
He literally believes in the spirits of medieval monks. Much to Bligh's surprise, a lot of the personalities do seem to be remarkably helpful. In fact, they egg him on. You know, you should dig further, you should look here, you should look there.
A monk named Johannes was the most anxious to be heard. He encouraged Bleibond's obsession with mapping out the abbey.
They were interested in mathematics and geometry as well. Bligh gets quite fond of Johannes and often asked for him if he was talking to a different personality.
Totally gripped, Bleibond begged for the location of King Arthur's grave. And Johannes had a shocking revelation. There was another, much older church, far beneath the abbey soil. In the search for Arthur's bones, Bleibond would have to dig deeper into Glastonbury's Dark Age past.
A very oldest part of Glastonbury Abbey was called the Old Church, the Ecclesia Vetusta. It was extremely ancient, and nobody was quite too sure how old it was or who was the original builder.
According to Johannes, the site of the Old Church was now occupied by the medieval Lady Chapel, which Bligh Bond had already located on his map. King Arthur's grave was just outside in the ancient cemetery. Bligh Bond realized he could use his mathematical knowledge to track it down.
So he thinks to himself, if the same ground plan has been used through the centuries, we can project backwards in time, exploring the geometry and the buildings, to find the form of the very first church.
Bligh Bond mapped out his search zone around the old church. Still obsessed by the number 6, he formed a hexagon. The cemetery and King Arthur's grave had to be somewhere within the symbolic shape. When his excavations began, Bligh Bond could hardly believe his eyes. There were bones everywhere. He had found the ancient cemetery, filled with centuries of the abbey's inhabitants. It was only a matter of time before he identified the grave of King Arthur.
He was quite convinced that he had discovered the original gravesite of Arthur and Guinevere, and that if he had had the season to dig, he would have been able to excavate the original grave cut.
But now, Bligh Bond made his greatest mistake. In 1918, he published a book called The Gate of Remembrance. It detailed his paranormal investigations at Glastonbury Abbey and revealed his séances with dead monks. The news spread like wildfire through the Church of England.
As you can imagine, this created something of a stir. The accusation was that Bligh wasn't an objective architect and archaeologist. How could he be? And that it wasn't Bligh who was director of excavations, but in fact it was the personalities of medieval monks that were actually directing what was going on site.
In the eyes of the church, Bligh Bond was flirting with the devil, not Christian archaeology. The clincher for them was that 6 rows of 111 make 666. The number of the beast.
This is the moment which the excavations are closed down and his services are no longer required.
Bligh Bond's quest for the bones of King Arthur was over. The horrified church shut down the excavations. In 1923, he was banished from the abbey for good. But a new Arthurian hero was already waiting to take up the quest. In 1908, the excavations at Glastonbury Abbey had been visited by a highly inquisitive 8-year-old boy. From the very start, he seemed destined to take up the quest for King Arthur. His name was Arthur Raleigh Radford, and in Bligh Bond, he found a charismatic mentor.
It seems highly likely that Bligh made quite an impression on the young Radford.
The boy was thrilled by Bond's fantastic stories of ancient monks and a legendary king.
Bligh always used to be the circus master when he took people around his excavations. Excavation work, that was his love, that was his passion, and that came across in everything he did. And that's the sort of thing that I would have thought that would appeal to a young mind.
There and then, young Radford decided to find King Arthur's grave. A quest he would follow for his entire career as the leading archaeologist of Dark Age Britain.
He'd been obsessed by the idea that the Arthurian past had had some archaeological reality.
But Radford had little time for Bligh Bond's paranormal methods. He was very much his own man, careful, logical, and systematic. A skeptic who wanted solid evidence above all else.
One of the things that Raleigh Radford has going for him is he isn't a dreamer. He's not guided by hidden forces or anything like that.
Radford was an extremely serious, earnest scholar. Very critical and very methodical.
He was a proper archaeologist. He wasn't chasing shadows.
But even Radford couldn't get permission to dig at Glastonbury. The Church of England was still wary after its experience with Bligh Bond. So Radford switched the focus of his search from the place of King Arthur's death to the place of his birth. 100 miles from Glastonbury, on the windswept Isle of Tintagel. The setting for the fantastic story that started King Arthur's legend. The story goes that King Arthur's father, Uther Pendragon, had fallen in love with the Duke of Cornwall's wife.
The Duke of Cornwall realised what was going on and so whisked his wife back to Cornwall and put her in the most secure location he could find, Tintagel.
Believing his castle was safe, the Duke made the mistake of leaving his wife at home. But Uther found a miraculous way to gain access.
The answer to an impossible task was to get Merlin the magician.
Merlin worked his magic. He transformed Uther into the exact likeness of the Duke, and he walked straight into the castle unopposed.
Uther Pendragon took the opportunity to sleep with the Duchess of Cornwall, disguised as her husband, then leave in the morning, and then catch up with the real Duke of Cornwall and kill him.
According to the legend, King Arthur was the result.
It was on that very night that King Arthur, the most famous of men, was conceived.
Few archaeologists took this legend seriously. But Radford himself was intrigued by the specific mention of Tintagel. He believed there had to be some reason why the legend was set on the island.
It seems reasonable to suppose there's no smoke without fire. He was pretty sure that following these legendary Arthurian associations could lead you to genuine 5th and 6th century sites.
Radford thought that Tintagel must have been part of a real 6th century Arthurian kingdom. And he planned to prove it with hard archaeological evidence. But he risked making himself a laughingstock. No other archaeologist believed the island had even been inhabited in the 6th century.
When Raleigh Radford started digging at Tintagel, scholarly views were that there was no Dark Age presence on Tintagel at all.
Radford set out to prove them all wrong. By digging deeper into Tintagel's past than anyone had before. He revealed a hidden Dark Age world. Rectangular buildings, laid out like a religious settlement.
He thought he'd identified there a series of characteristics which showed that the site was in fact a 6th century monastery.
Digging into the ruins, Radford found evidence that could precisely date the monastery to King Arthur's 6th century. It was a special type of pottery that had never before been found in Britain.
Here's, I think, a really fascinating element in the discoveries that Radford made at Tintagel, that The pot shards, the pieces of pottery that he was turning up in vast quantities, were not locally made.
The pottery came from the Eastern Mediterranean. It proved that Dark Ages Tintagel was not just a monastery, but an international trading post.
During the 5th and 6th centuries, Tintagel was plainly in contact with traders bringing Eastern Mediterranean imported pottery.
What he's discovered is a sophisticated 6th century world.
Radford called his pottery Tintagelware. It showed what everyone else thought was an empty island had in fact been a thriving community.
Radford's discovery of imported Mediterranean pottery at Tintagel in the 1930s was a turning point for the archaeology of 5th and 6th century Britain.
There he was, uncovering with spadework absolute tangible evidence of this wealthy, sophisticated, international cosmopolitan world in Dark Age Britain. There was absolute groundbreaking, pioneering stuff from a man who absolutely knew what he was doing.
By following up on the King Arthur legend, Radford had proved something that no one else had even suspected. Tintagel had been part of a thriving 6th century Britain, just like the legends of King Arthur had described. Radford believed he had uncovered King Arthur's kingdom. Now he wanted evidence of King Arthur himself.
All it will now take is the opportunity to start digging at sites connected with the rest of the legends of King Arthur.
Radford was ready for Glastonbury Abbey and the mystery buried somewhere beneath its ancient ruins. In 1951, the church authorities finally gave him permission to excavate. Now all he had to do was find King Arthur's grave. Radford tackled his task like a master detective. He would make a detailed forensic analysis of the key eyewitness account from the 12th century.
What really happened outside Glastonbury Abbey in 1191.
The medieval monks had called in a historian named Gerald of Wales to verify their find of Arthur's grave. Radford planned to put Gerald's evidence under the microscope. Exhibit A was King Arthur himself. Gerald of Wales described his bones as those of an imposing warrior.
He describes how large the shin bones were, how large the eye sockets of this great heroic leader. You can imagine him probably standing 7 foot tall with his stockinged feet.
For Radford, the vital clue was a deep wound in the skull, exactly matching King Arthur's fatal battle wound as described by legend.
The body had several wounds to its head, mostly healed, but the last one, the major wound, was unhealed and presumably had been what had killed him.
Exhibit B was very different. The skeleton of a woman, with long hair still clinging to the skull. It was Queen Guinevere.
One of the monks was so overcome with romantic enthusiasm that he'd got hold of the hank of hair, which unfortunately then turned to dust.
Finally, Exhibit C, a lead cross identifying the skeletons as King Arthur and his wife. Gerald had copied down its ancient inscription.
When they came to look at the inscription on the lead cross, they read it as saying, "Here lies buried the famous King Arthur in the Isle of Avalon with his second wife, Guinevere."
Gerald was sure the monks had found King Arthur's grave. But Raleigh Radford had reason to be sceptical. After the destruction of Glastonbury Abbey, all three key pieces of evidence were now missing. And Radford had to consider another, very different interpretation of Gerald's story. The find of King Arthur's grave could have been an elaborate fraud.
There have always been rumours of skullduggery, of deliberate falsification of the evidence. It is absolutely possible that monks could have hoaxed the whole discovery. It really is a kind of medieval scene of the crime mystery.
The monks' motivation for fraud would be financial gain. They were trying to prove they had the rights to their land.
You have to remember that Glastonbury Abbey was one of the biggest landowners in the country back in the 12th century. It was now up to the monks to try and justify why they had all that land.
With King Arthur's body in their possession, the monks could argue that he had granted them a royal charter.
And it could be seen as a seal of approval, a confirmation of some of those charters, if they could find King Arthur's burial.
So at face value, the discovery of King Arthur's grave was suspiciously convenient. Gerald of Wales could have been the unwitting victim of the monks' deception.
They could have found a convenient body and shown it to Gerald of Wales. He was very much the kind of person you'd want to have as a publicist, and he was specifically invited over to Glastonbury Abbey to talk to the monks and look at their discovery.
The inscription on the lead cross, as recorded by Gerald, was the most damning evidence of all. Modern archaeologists had dated the style of the lettering to the 12th century, exactly as if the monks had faked it.
They can create something which, in the context of the time, is a plausible forgery. Can monks really be trusted? Who knows?
Radford was the only archaeologist who believed the monks were telling the truth. He thought the lettering could be much older than the 12th century, and that the cross itself had been genuine. But to prove that Gerald's story was true, Radford had to find the only piece of evidence that was still in existence. The grave itself, still buried somewhere in the Abbey's oldest cemetery. But thanks to Frederick Bligh Bond, he knew exactly where to start his search.
Raleigh Radford had the big advantage that he could follow up the work of Bligh Bond. That gave Raleigh Radford a very good ground plan for the kind of places he was going to have to be digging if he wanted to find King Arthur's tomb.
Radford focused his excavations around the Abbey's old church, the Ecclesia Vetusta. The same place where Frederick Bligh Bond had been digging 40 years before, guided by the spirit of the medieval monk Johannes. But Radford planned a much more scientific approach. Peter Point's right, an archaeologist on the team, was fired by his enthusiasm.
He was an inspirational character, there with you all the time.
Urged on by Radford, the team dug deeper into the Abbey's ancient cemetery. But they face the same challenge as Bligh Bond, to somehow identify Arthur's grave amongst many. Radford's vast experience gave him an ingenious way to solve the problem.
His depth of knowledge was, it oozed out everywhere.
Radford's research had uncovered a key historical detail. The site of the old church was now occupied by the medieval Lady Chapel. King Arthur had been buried south of the third window. His grave was directly in between two gigantic pillars.
One was 26 feet high, and one was 19 feet high.
The pillars were stolen after the abbey was destroyed. But Radford thought monuments this size must have left some trace behind. He planned to dig a 60-foot trench to find them.
We worked out where we thought the site was.
The trench took weeks of careful excavation, but then came the breakthrough. The pillars that once marked Arthur's grave had left gaping holes in the ground.
That gave the exact location, almost X marks the spot, for where he would have to start digging.
Directly between the holes, there were clear signs of disturbed earth. It was an empty grave, exactly where Radford said it would be.
The sort of area you would respectfully put a body into the ground.
Radford and Points Right soon found more proof that they were digging in the right place. Tiny chippings of stone showed the 12th century monks had also been in the grave.
And they'd been digging down in exactly the same spot.
In 1191, when the monks dug up Arthur's grave, the abbey was under reconstruction. The local building material, Dolting stone, was everywhere. Radford found that some of it had gone into the grave. It was a clear indication that at the time of the building works, the grave had been open.
There was the building chippings from the Ladies' Chapel that was being put up at that time, got down the hole when they'd made the disturbance.
The hole that they'd made had gradually filled up with these chippings as though it had been backfilled.
The stone chippings proved that the monks had definitely dug up the grave in 1191. But their story could still have been a hoax. Radford needed further evidence that the original grave was even older than the 12th century. And when he examined his trench more closely, he found it. There was a foundation wall designed to contain packed earth, and Radford soon discovered its purpose in the abbey's historical records. Long before 1191, the 10th century abbot of Glastonbury had raised the level of the entire cemetery to venerate its famous occupant.
And he could see that St Dunstan, or Dunstan the abbot of Glastonbury in Anglo-Saxon times, had been reorganising the graveyard at a higher level.
Arthur's grave had been dug up and reburied long before the monks of 1191 rediscovered it. Radford was sure the lead cross came from this 10th century reburial. It was put in the grave to make sure King Arthur was still properly marked. The 12th century monks hadn't faked it.
His theory was this was something which had been made between the time of King Arthur and the discovery of Arthur's grave in 1191.
With evidence to show that the 12th century monks had been telling the truth, Radford was ready to go public. He gave an interview to the BBC.
The monks said that they found in the coffin a leaden cross with a Latin inscription which says, "Here lies Arthur, the famous king in the island of Avalon." That has been dismissed as a forgery. In my view, on the basis of the lettering and the form of the cross, it dates not from the late 12th century, but from the 10th century.
If Radford was right, then the monks really had found King Arthur, the king who had founded their church in the 6th century.
It was traditional in the 12th century to put the founder of your church, your monastery, in a great tomb in the choir. And I have very little doubt that that's what they intended to do.
Radford thought quite definitely that this was the grave from which the bodies of Arthur and Guinevere were removed.
Radford was sure the account by Gerald of Wales was true. The monks had dug up a grave. Radford had found it. It really did happen in 1191. The stone chippings said so. The cross identified King Arthur, and Radford could show it wasn't a fake. There was only one piece of evidence he couldn't find: Tintagel-ware, to prove that King Arthur's original burial was in the 6th century.
Radford used imported Mediterranean pottery as the key indicator for sites of the 5th and 6th centuries.
It was one of the few things he didn't find on that excavation. It could well have been that those Tintagel-ware fragments had once been there and gone, but the truth was he hadn't found his smoking gun.
Radford knew his evidence was all circumstantial. There was nothing to link the grave directly to King Arthur.
This is where I excavated in 1962 and 63 and found the great hole from which they dug out someone.
Someone?
Well,
Arthur?
I think it was Arthur, but of course I can't prove it.
Radford never did prove the existence of King Arthur. But even at the age of 90, he was still visiting sites like Tintagel, still hoping for that conclusive final piece of missing evidence. He died in 1998, still on his quest.
Personally, I'm very much on that side of Raleigh Radford. He must have been persuaded there was something behind these Arthurian legends.
But Radford's story has a final twist. A decade after his death, archaeologists reassessed his finds at Glastonbury Abbey. They discovered that Radford had in fact found Tintagel-ware in the Abbey grounds. Radford never knew it, but he had proof all along that Glastonbury dated back to the 6th century. While most experts still don't believe in King Arthur, Radford was convinced this would have been the heart of his Dark Age kingdom. A fitting last resting place for Britain's greatest legend. He was one of the most feared rulers in history. Ivan the Terrible, the first Tsar of all the Russias.
He was a torturer, a murderer, a rapist.
Definitely a psychopath.
But legend says the ruthless tyrant had a secret. A library of priceless books hidden in the labyrinth beneath the Kremlin.
Ivan the Terrible's library is really one of the great underground myths.
The mythical library contained the greatest lost works of ancient literature. In the 20th century, one man set out to prove it really existed.
If it was discovered, it would transform our knowledge of the past.
It was a journey into the darkest terrors of the Soviet Union.
Staletsky was really a man bordering on obsession.
You also had to be brave, of course.
His terrifying enemy, the forces of Stalin's secret police.
Staletsky was crazy. You don't go looking for secrets of the Soviet Union.
It was a deadly treasure hunt, where the ultimate prize was knowledge.
We are talking about a man who is seriously prepared to risk his life.
This is the story of the quest for Ivan the Terrible's library. The legend of Ivan the Terrible's library began far from Russia, in 15th century Constantinople. The capital of the Byzantine Empire was the dazzling center of European culture.
It is the power engine that drives Christian Europe. This is a world where there is a real premium on scholarship and on learning.
One of the city's greatest treasures was said to be its magnificent library, home to priceless masterpieces of ancient Greek and Roman literature. Legend says the books were bound in gold.
In those days, of course, books were extremely valuable.
Books typically would be encrusted by jewels or would have beautiful decorations on them that were objects of enormous beauty as well as of scholarship.
But in 1453, the empire fell to Muslim invaders.
It's a heartbreaking moment. Churches being converted into mosques, books disappearing, jewels being sacked, men and women being pressed into slavery. The whole story is a very difficult and painful one.
To escape the dying city, the emperor's niece, Sophia, was married to a Russian prince. The legend says that 800 precious books went with her to Moscow.
The books that Sophia brought over, if they were discovered now, would probably triple the volume of Greco-Roman literature available to us.
But it was Sophia's grandson who created the legend of the library. In 1547, Ivan the Terrible became the Tsar of Russia. He was a tyrant and sadist who reveled in bizarre forms of torture.
He only ever laughed when observing tortures. He would have people skinned alive, for example. They would be put into boiling water and then into ice water, and then their skin would be just pulled off.
But despite his cruelty, Ivan was a man of learning and sophistication.
Knowledge-hungry person, ahead of his times, you know, multilinguist, polymath.
Poet, a musician, a theologian, a philosopher, and he established the first printing press in Russia.
According to legend, the scholarly Ivan took extreme measures to guard his precious library. He hid it away, deep beneath the Kremlin. In a man-made labyrinth of tunnels, formed by sealing off Moscow's underground rivers. The secret location of the library changer was known only to a trusted few. But Ivan's reign descended into paranoia. No one was safe, not even his own family.
The legend says that Ivan killed anyone who knew of the secret location of the library. He even murdered his son.
Finally, Ivan himself died during a game of chess. He took his greatest secret to the grave.
And that looked like the end of the line. Everybody who knew about the library and the places where it could have been hidden was now dead.
By the 20th century, there was no evidence that the library had ever existed. Most Russian academics thought it was a legend and nothing more. But in 1912, an ambitious archaeologist set out to prove them wrong.
He didn't think it was just any old mystery. He believed with every fiber of his body that the library actually existed and that he was going to find it.
Ignaty Stiletsky was raised in the Ukraine, but he learned his trade in the ancient city of Jerusalem. While exploring its warren of underground caves and tunnels, he'd first heard tell of the legend of Ivan's library. It brought him to Moscow and put his subterranean skills to the ultimate test.
Stiletsky solved mysteries by digging.
Stiletsky used to tap his way along the walls, trying to listen for change in the sound, in the resonance of the rock that may have indicated a cavity or space behind that he could dig into.
Stiletsky thought the academics of the Russian establishment were afraid to get their hands dirty. Finding Ivan the Terrible's library was a job for a seasoned underground expert.
It must have been like a red flag to a bull, really. When the establishment tell you that it doesn't exist, that must be incredibly exciting for an ambitious, pushy young scholar.
It was his obsession throughout his adult life to find that library.
Stiletsky planned to dig beneath the walls of the Kremlin. But his first step was to target the likeliest location where Ivan might have hidden his library.
The research you do before going underground is the intellectual challenge. It's a puzzle. You're trying to put the pieces together. The final piece of the puzzle is the dig, is going underground itself.
Stiletsky's starting point was a map of the Kremlin that charted the building in the 16th century. A sprawling citadel of towers, cathedrals, and military buildings.
Kremlin is a mini-city. Like so many fortified towns in the West, it was supposed basically to harbor the whole population of the town with all the infrastructure in place.
Finding the library was a daunting task. The Kremlin covered an area of more than 3 million square feet. But by piecing together snippets of information, Stiletsky created a second and far more specialized map. It was a rough outline of the Kremlin's vast and ancient network of underground tunnels. Ivan had used it to hide his library and to hide himself in times of trouble.
There were lots of tunnels built for security reasons, because those were not vegetarian times in Russian history, and there were frequent uprisings in which everybody would be cut to little pieces.
Stiletsky noticed that the tunnels seemed to converge beneath one of the Kremlin's most famous landmarks. He decided that this building, the Arsenal Tower, would be his #1 target in the quest for Ivan's library.
The Arsenal Tower was probably the most prominent one, and it was also the most likely place under which the treasure could be hidden.
Stiletsky looked deeper into the tower's history, and it soon became clear that he was on the right track.
Stiletsky discovered he wasn't the first man to dig under the Arsenal Tower in the Kremlin.
In the 18th century, the Russian nobleman Prince Mikhail Sherbatov had blazed a trail for Stiletsky to follow. Beneath the Arsenal Tower, he discovered a gateway to the secret labyrinth beyond. Exploring further, he found the tunnels were lined with distinctive white stone. Sherbatov never found Ivan's library, but his story gave Stiletsky vital clues.
Streletsky definitely thought he could do better than Shubatov because Shubatov never did find the library and Streletsky thought he would.
Streletsky now knew he had to find Sherbatov's gate. If he could break through it, a labyrinth of white stone would mark the way to the library.
Streletsky thought that every time he could see a white stone, he is on the right track.
Streletsky was ready to search the Kremlin, but he'd be taking his life in his hands. In 1912, revolution was in the air. Ruthless oppression by the Tsar Nicholas II had earned him the nickname Bloody Nicholas. His fearsome secret police had the Kremlin under tight control.
Throughout the reign of Nicholas II, there was a very real danger of revolutionary outbursts. I mean, his own grandfather was blown in half by a bomb. So he had a secret police, and therefore anybody digging in the darkness of tunnels under Kremlin was bound to be seen as at least a potential subversive.
Streletsky hit on a subterfuge. He offered to do an archaeological survey of the Arsenal Tower's basement. His team were kept under close supervision, with the deeper levels of the building strictly out of bounds. But Streletsky waited for the guards and workers to take their lunch break, then slipped out of sight.
He realized only too well that by doing so he was risking his life. But for someone who is obsessed, this can actually be an attraction.
There was an iron stairwell leading deep below the tower. To Streletsky's amazement, Sherbatov's gate was at the bottom. The ancient bars were rusted through. The hunt for the library chamber was on.
For Streletsky, it was a challenge. Here he could test his skills.
Streletsky had to work fast before his absence was noted. And exploring further, his attention was drawn to the floor. Scraping away layers of gravel and earth, he made a tantalizing discovery. There was a cavity which revealed the secret labyrinth below. But there was no time to find a way down.
He still had some common sense left. Doing so would mean an immediate arrest.
Streletsky got back in the nick of time. To investigate the tunnels in safety, he knew he would need official permission.
The Kremlin, after all, is a fortress, and it always has been. You need to have the benediction of the ruling elite to be allowed anywhere near, and to go and look and see what's there.
But the academic establishment was blocking Streletsky's way. Its most eminent figure was Professor Sergei Belakurov.
Belakurov was that sort of scientist, Russian scientist, let's say, who were always very careful, not to raise their head above water, because in Russia, the moment you raise your head above water, it gets hit.
Belakurov had written an official report dismissing the library as a myth. So there would be no digging in the Kremlin unless Streletsky came up with hard evidence of the library's existence.
Belakurov was a real authority on the subject. So as far as the Russian scientists were concerned, the matter was closed. I mean, there was no library, and that was it.
Streletsky vowed to prove them all wrong.
Faith is important, and that is part of Streletsky's crusade, really. It's motivated by a deep belief that these books really did exist once upon a time, and that they can be found.
Streletsky planned to reinvestigate a key story from Belakurov's report. In the 16th century, An Estonian scholar named Johann Vettermann had reputedly seen the library itself. Ivan the Terrible had invited him to translate its ancient masterpieces from the original Greek and Latin. But having learned the secret of the library, Vettermann was now in fear for his life.
He was a clever man, and he was terrified.
Ivan the Terrible has a truly terrible reputation, and he's renowned for acts of extraordinary cruelty.
Vettermann pretended to start his task, then made good his escape from Moscow. But not before making a list of all the books he could remember. Vettermann's list had supposedly resurfaced in 19th century Estonia, but had now disappeared. Belakurov thought the story was fiction. Stiletsky aimed to prove it was fact.
He didn't believe Belakurov's conclusions.
Stiletsky headed 500 miles from Moscow to the last known location of Vettermann's list. The town library in Perno, one of the oldest towns in Estonia. But after years of neglect, its storerooms were in disarray.
It was a mess. Everything was scattered around, and actually quite a lot of effort was needed to find what he was looking for.
You can imagine that this library was chock full of nuts, meaning scrolls, rolls, books, scraps of paper. Things were by no means easy to find there.
Stiletsky was drowning in a sea of dusty books and reams of paper. He didn't even know what Vettermann's list would look like.
But because Stiletsky was convinced he was going to find the catalog, he kept digging and digging and digging and digging.
The breakthrough finally came when a tattered fragment of paper caught Stiletsky's eye. It was a string of illustrious names, and the list was initialed with the Russian form of the letter V.
The letter V at the bottom, which could mean only one thing: Vettermann. Eureka, he found it.
Stiletsky was dumbfounded. Vettermann's list was a roll call of the greatest authors of antiquity.
Vettermann's list is one of those sort of totally unbelievable lists. Every treasure that we don't have in Latin and Greek literature is on it.
The list contained 100 unknown volumes of Livy's histories of the Roman Empire. And there were lost works of ancient Greek drama.
The idea that we could find plays by Aristophanes that aren't known about or are known but are lost, I mean, it's unbelievable.
Finally, Vettermann listed missing pages from the 12 biographies of Caesar by the historian Suetonius.
It looks like a list of what a historian would like to find if he was let into the great sweet shop of history.
If Stiletsky could find Ivan's library, he would literally change human history.
It would transform our knowledge of the past. I mean, I think you'd lick your chops if you had any hope of catching a few pages of one of these texts. The idea that you might find all of them together, it's astonishing.
But now Stiletsky made a fateful mistake. He left Vettermann's list behind and took his own copy back to Moscow, certain that no one could now stand in his way.
If you have a catalog, it proves that Belakurov was wrong and Stiletsky was right.
But to Stiletsky's disbelief, he still couldn't find a historian who would take him seriously. No one would risk their reputation on a scrap of paper. Stiletsky didn't even have the original list in his hands.
Stiletsky had been given the chance of a lifetime, and he bungled it.
Access to the Kremlin was denied. And there was no second chance. In 1914, Russia was hurled into World War I. Swept up in the tide of history, Stiletsky was banished from Moscow and sent to the front.
The war was a disaster for Russia and for the Tsar.
The Tsar was badly prepared for conflict. Entire Russian armies were annihilated. At home, the country exploded into violent revolution. For ordinary people, the only priority was survival.
When the Bolshevik Revolution swept through Russia, Russia was essentially destroyed. I mean, millions were dying or starving to death or emigrating. Great historical buildings were being razed to the ground.
In the turmoil, Stiletsky's quest for Ivan the Terrible's library was totally irrelevant.
With that kind of cataclysm unfolding, a lowly little library was of little interest to anybody, and Stiletsky must have feared that that was it.
Who cares about the library, even it was the Tsar's library? Who cares about books? Books were only good for throwing into the oven to make yourself warm.
The victorious Bolsheviks murdered the Tsar and took power in Moscow. For ordinary citizens, the times were more dangerous than ever.
The Bolsheviks, they were ready to see counter-revolution everywhere.
For 7 years, Stiletsky kept his head down. His obsession with the Kremlin could only attract deadly suspicion.
He was still an archaeologist, but now he had to become a careful archaeologist. Anybody dealing with the Bolsheviks had to be good at playing the game, because the bad players get shot.
Stiletsky's only chance of survival was to adapt to the new Soviet Union.
Stiletsky realizes that to be able to carry on with this project, he has to become what in modern terms we call politically correct.
In 1924, Stiletsky was ready to renew his quest by campaigning in the communist newspapers. He claimed that underground exploration would reveal the treasures of Russia and give them back to the people.
He wanted to sound like a good Marxist, taking treasures from the rich and giving them back to the poor.
Stiletsky proclaimed, "The time has come to turn underground Moscow inside out." His timing was perfect. The communists themselves were already digging up the city. The new Moscow metro would make Russia the envy of the world. It was the ultimate expression of Soviet power under its sinister new leader, Joseph Stalin.
There was now a new Tsar in the Kremlin named Joseph Stalin, and he wanted to immortalize his Tsardom by building the greatest engineering works known to man, which is the underground network under the city known as the Moscow Metro.
Stiletsky was made an official archaeologist on the metro excavations. His task? To assess any unexpected discoveries by the engineers. The tunnels were full of the flotsam and jetsam of Moscow's ancient history. Shards of pottery had somehow found their way down from the city's kitchens. But secretly, Stiletsky was hunting for bigger game. Ivan the Terrible's library.
Stiletsky thought he probably could latch on to the tail end of that project and do his own thing.
The metro was extending Moscow's ancient labyrinth with 50 miles of new tunnels. They even penetrated beneath the Kremlin itself. Whenever he had the chance, Stiletsky listened for hollow walls and the library chamber. But with Stalin's agents everywhere, he was playing a very dangerous game.
This was really very brave, dicing with death. He was now at the very heart of the system, swarming with secret policemen.
Stalin ruled the Soviet Union by terror. By the late 1920s, he was gathering all the reins of power in his own hands. His image and statues dominated the streets. All opposition was ruthlessly hunted down by his vast network of secret police.
Stalin is generally believed to be paranoid. He lived in constant fear of assassination.
Anyone working beneath the Kremlin would be under suspicion. And as Stiletsky homed in on the Arsenal Tower, his finds were turning sinister. The workers were terrified to discover skeletons beneath their shovels, unidentified victims of some ancient crime. For Stiletsky, it was a daily reminder of Moscow's violent past.
It was very dangerous to keep doing what he was doing, but nevertheless he kept listening, kept putting his ears to the walls and listening and listening and listening, risking his life every single moment.
By 1933, Stalin had assumed total control of the Communist Party. The rule of law was replaced by the word of a single man. Stalin now had the power of life and death over every citizen of the Soviet Union.
No one was immune from disappearing from the street or from one's flat in broad daylight or at night. No one, not even the people who shouted louder than everyone else, "Long live Comrade Stalin."
In this terrifying climate, Stiletsky's chance to find the library finally arrived. Word came through of a serious accident underground, close to the Arsenal Tower. Stiletsky raced to the scene. The metro excavations had caused a massive collapse, all the way through to street level. But for Stiletsky, it was a godsend. Because the collapsing tunnel walls had also revealed a hidden passage. Stiletsky was certain they had broken through to Ivan's secret labyrinth. But when he finally got there, he was desperate to investigate. But the workers wouldn't let him come near. The collapse had brought Moscow to a standstill. Stalin's henchmen in the Kremlin couldn't move their cars.
That's a very serious, one would say potentially lethal problems for the engineers, because one thing they have to do, above all, is to keep the traffic flowing for the party bosses in the Kremlin.
The terrified engineers were racing to repair the damage.
They didn't care much about secret passageways. What they did care about was staying alive.
There was nothing Stiletsky could do. Stalin's men were in control.
Stiletsky was absolutely devastated. That was the chance he had been waiting for so long, and now it looked like he had lost it.
Stiletsky's dream was in tatters. The breakthrough was sealed for good.
That must have been a shattering blow to Stiletsky. So near, yet so far.
Right then, Stiletsky decided to stake his life on one last desperate gamble. Somehow, He had to get Stalin's regime to back his quest for the library. And he realized that Ivan the Terrible himself could show him the way. Streletsky planned to exploit a curious story about the Tsar. During Ivan's reign in the 16th century, he'd made frequent trips to the forests west of the Kremlin. His companions were trusted members of his personal bodyguard. But they would come back from the woods alone, with an unbelievable tale to tell.
Ivan wanted to cultivate an awesome, almost supernatural image.
According to the story, Ivan would simply vanish, as if by magic. He would later reappear in the Kremlin palaces, as if nothing had happened.
He did want people to believe he had almost demonic powers and could vanish in thin air and appear out of thin air.
Streletsky knew better, of course. Ivan had used a secret tunnel to spirit himself away. Streletsky published the story in a Moscow newspaper. Ivan's tunnel was clearly a dangerous breach in Stalin's security, and Streletsky claimed only he could find it.
He's now going for broke. He decides to make all his findings public. That was really like playing hide and seek with death.
He's really burning his bridges all over the place, and they're ablaze. There's really no way back.
It was a message Stalin's henchmen couldn't ignore, and it wasn't long before they had Streletsky in their sights.
The voice there says, "Comrade Streletsky, your digging in the tunnels is starting to disturb us."
The menacing voice on the line was one of Stalin's most ruthless security chiefs. Rudolf Peterson was the commandant of the Kremlin itself, a brutal enforcer with the power of life and death.
He was responsible for the continuing good health of the Soviet leaders. That job was frightening for him, and he himself was a very frightening man. He personally would butcher people.
Peterson wanted to know all the secrets of the Kremlin's past. Terrified, Streletsky told him about Ivan the Terrible's library and the tunnels leading from the Arsenal Tower. But then Peterson gave him the surprise of his life.
He was afraid of being arrested. But, like it often happens in Russian history, a sudden, unexpected turn of events. Instead of that, he was given a carte blanche for excavations under the Kremlin and even access to the Arsenal Tower.
Peterson wanted help to find the tunnels and close the breach in Kremlin security. Streletsky could hardly believe his luck.
He told his diary, "I have the bluebird of happiness in my hands. At 10 o'clock on the 13th of November, 1933, I will finally be allowed back into the Kremlin."
More than 20 years after his first visit, Streletsky re-entered the basement of the Arsenal Tower. But this time, there was no need to hide. He had Peterson's blessing and a team of engineers. His mission? To map out the Kremlin's secret tunnels and find Ivan the Terrible's library.
He can't believe his luck. It's like a miracle. He's got the keys to the Kremlin now.
Everything was just as Streletsky had left it in 1912. But now he could explore in safety. On rediscovering the cavity in the floor, Streletsky's only thought was to find a way through to the levels below and Ivan's secret labyrinth of white stone.
There had to be another chamber underneath, made of that same white stone.
The lifelong underground explorer was in his element. This was the breakthrough Strzelecki had always dreamed of. At last, he was about to penetrate the heart of Ivan the Terrible's labyrinth.
I mean, he must have been ecstatic.
Just as he'd expected, the tunnels were lined with white stone. Ivan the Terrible's library was hidden somewhere behind the walls.
He must have been absolutely passionate about trying to find this, as any scholar would do. Every door he opened, every hatch he lifted, every stone he unturned, his heart must have leapt, thinking he'd found things.
Strzelecki then writes a report to the commandant of the Kremlin. The tunnels, which I have been dreaming of for 25 years, have been found. I have broken through 4.5 centuries of mystery.
Strzelecki told Peterson that it would take months to explore every inch of the tunnels. There was a clear danger from collapsing walls.
Anything can happen in a tunnel that's 400 or 500 years old. The floor can collapse under you, the roof can come in, the props can fall apart because they've rotted through. The risks are huge.
As the weeks passed, Strzelecki's team suffered terrifying accidents. If the worst happened and the roof came down, they were as good as dead.
If you were doing underground exploration, the roof caved in, well, your chance of rescue was pretty slim. And if you're a long way underground, it can take hours for rescuers to get to you, by which time it's game over.
The excavation team soon tired of Strzelecki's relentless quest.
The workers didn't really care about Ivan the Terrible's secret library. Why on earth should they be buried alive, working for this crazy man?
Strzelecki drove himself close to exhaustion, but he had to keep going. He knew that everyone in the Soviet Union was living on borrowed time. By 1934, Stalin's paranoia had reached its peak. He used the death of a key rival, Sergei Kirov, as a pretext for mass murder. In the Great Terror that followed, at least 1 million people died. Under torture, Stalin's old comrades from the revolution confessed to treason. After public show trials, they were brutally executed. In Stalin's Russia, the price of failure was death. In Strzelecki's reports to Commandant Peterson, he made rash promises that results were just around the corner.
March 2nd, 1934. Everywhere, we see the white stone ceiling of the Kremlin tunnels. The library of Ivan the Terrible is about to be found.
Strzelecki had evidence that he was closing in on Ivan the Terrible's greatest secrets. In the deep recesses of the labyrinth, he'd found old weapons, possibly dating from the late 16th century, a period when Ivan, like Stalin, had slaughtered his enemies in the Kremlin dungeons.
This was at the time of Ivan's Great Terror, when his secret police, their prisoners, were murdering thousands and thousands of his opponents.
The only place more secret than Ivan's dungeons was the library itself. Strzelecki was convinced it had to be nearby.
He says, "I'm sure that I'm on the verge of a great discovery."
Strzelecki pinned his hopes on one last dig through the surrounding walls. The culmination of his lifelong quest. But the result was a catastrophe. Excavations had hardly begun when the workers struck a well directly connected to the underground river nearby.
That must have been a really terrifying moment, all that water starting to pour in to the space he was working in.
Strzelecki's only desperate thought was to find the library and somehow save the books.
At the very point, but he is so close to finding the library he had been looking for so many years, he could have destroyed it himself.
It was a hopeless situation. Strzelecki's team could do nothing except run for their lives.
This is going to be a river, it's an unexhaustible supply of water, and it was really time to get out.
Within reach of his dream, Strzelecki was forced to leave the Kremlin behind. The commandant shut down the excavations.
He has literally undermined the Kremlin, causing damage to the substructure. And Stalin, with his henchmen, were immediately above his head.
Strzelecki is now very close to a total mental and physical breakdown. The aim of his life seems to be out of reach.
For months, as workers labored to repair the damage, Strzelecki was forced to wait at home. He was living in fear, not just for himself, but for Ivan the Terrible's library.
Strzelecki is terrified that the library will flood, or else that the workers might seal off some of the vital passageways.
He says the sword of Damocles is hanging over the library of Ivan the Terrible.
Strzelecki was hoping against hope that somehow he could survive the disaster and pick up his quest.
The only thing that can save him now is a phone call from the Kremlin, from Peterson, saying to him to carry on with his excavations.
And then the phone call comes.
But the man on the line wasn't Peterson. There was a new commandant in the Kremlin.
In 1935, in Stalin's Russia, this could only mean one thing. Peterson was as good as dead.
In the Great Terror, Stalin saw every high-ranking official as a rival. Peterson had too much power to be allowed to live.
For that crime, there was no reprieve. A bullet in the back of the neck was the only possible punishment.
In the chaos of the Great Terror, Strzelecki himself disappeared from history. In the worst-case scenario, he too had been executed, or had simply vanished into Stalin's prison camps, like countless others.
They disappeared all the time, and they would just walk out of their house to buy a loaf of bread, never to be seen again. Had someone like Strzelecki disappeared, I mean, it would have been completely unnoticed.
In the late 1950s, after Stalin's death, the mystery of Strzelecki's whereabouts was finally solved. A Moscow journalist rediscovered Strzelecki's diaries. They detailed his lifelong struggle through the upheavals of Russian history and his early years training as an archaeologist in Jerusalem, the ancient city where Strzelecki first learned of the sacred texts in the libraries of Ivan the Terrible.
I think that's really where he got the bug, and which drove him on to look for Ivan the Terrible's library.
For the first time, the diaries revealed that Strzelecki had a family. The journalist tracked them down at his last known address on an old Moscow street.
It was right by the Kremlin, within view of the Arsenal towers.
Strzelecki's wife filled in the last tragic chapter in his story. Thwarted in his quest, Strzelecki had filled their home with his strange underground finds. A broken man, he'd cocooned himself in the secrets of the Kremlin.
This sort of obsession, which is probably bordering on madness, you know, that's the Russian scientist for you, you know.
At the end, Stiletsky's mind seemed to have failed. He was losing the ability to even communicate.
Shortly before his death, as his wife later recalled, he started mumbling and bumbling something incoherent.
But this story gave the journalist an amazing idea. Remembering Stiletsky's work in Jerusalem, he tried speaking a few words of Arabic to Stiletsky's puzzled wife.
And she suddenly remembered one word. That's it, she said. That's what he said, maktaba. Maktaba.
Stiletsky had not been babbling. He knew exactly what he was trying to say.
Maktaba is the Arabic for library.
Stiletsky believed in the library to his dying breath. In his own mind, he was still on the quest. And in modern Moscow, his legend lives on.
Moscow has a very active community of underground explorers called the Moscow Diggers. And of course, they're still looking for the fabled legend of Ivan the Terrible's library as well.
The Diggers are still playing Stiletsky's old game of hide-and-seek with the rulers in the Kremlin. They're still on the hunt for the lost library of Ivan the Terrible.
Just because Stiletsky never found Ivan the Terrible's library doesn't mean that it doesn't exist.
The library of lost masterpieces may still be waiting to rewrite the pages of history.
I do believe that Ivan the Terrible's library existed and still exists and still can be found.
I have absolutely no doubt in my mind that it did exist.
Ignaty Stiletsky may one day receive his final vindication. Joan of Arc is France's most famous patron saint. Burned at the stake, her remains were said to have been lost, thrown into the River Seine. Until in 1867, her bones appeared out of the blue.
It's a bit like crime scene investigation. You have the remains. Who do they belong to?
Some thought it was a hoax, others the real deal. France's leading forensic pathologist, Dr. Philippe Chalier, became fascinated by this mysterious and macabre cold case.
They are not just bones for me, they are patients.
A detective tale that tested Chalier's expertise to the limit. The autopsy of an international icon, where science meets myth.
It connects you to the past in a very unexpected way.
This is the story of Chalier's quest to find the truth behind the relics that could be Saint Joan of Arc. Paris, France, 2006. Dr. Philippe Chalier was a pathologist. His patients were the city's dead, dissecting their bodies for clues about why they died. But he was also France's most famous forensic sleuth, dubbed the Indiana Jones of graveyards. He couldn't resist the coldest cases, long-dead kings, queens, and mistresses, whose deaths were shrouded in mystery.
I'm a physician, first of all, not an archaeologist or anthropologist. So they are not just bones for me, they are patients. And I look at them as if it would be anybody in the subway or on the streets, but dead, of course.
His patient files include the English king Richard the Lionheart, and the French King Henry IV, but all the remains, however small, held secrets from the past.
Even just a tiny bone, for me, it's a patient. All these bodies are, for me, patients, and when I look at their bones, I'm just looking like in a patient's file, like a historian book.
Chalier was destined to become a myth hunter, and it all began on a trip to the Italian city of Pompeii when he was just 7 years old. A volcano had erupted in 79 AD, burying buildings in boiling ash. People were frozen in time.
I remember the cadaver of a woman, and this was very important for me because I was facing not a skeleton, but the three-dimensional form of a dead individual, and I wanted to make this individual speaking to me.
By 10 years old, Chalier had found a human skull, someone who died some 1,300 years before. He wanted the dead to tell him their story, to speak to him through their remains. So he went on to forge a career in medicine. As a forensic pathologist, he knew he could search for the truth behind history's most famous deaths. In 2006, Chalier had just closed his latest case. He was returning the medieval remains of a king's mistress to a provincial museum in Chinon, central France, when by chance he spotted his next patient.
50 centimeters close to these remains were the relics of the so-called Joan of Arc.
Chalier had discovered a long-forgotten box of bones, but these were no ordinary remains. Legend said they belonged to France's patron saint, Joan of Arc. But how did they find their way to Chinon? Chalier learnt the bones trace back to Paris in 1867. Vast swathes of the capital were being knocked down for one of the most ambitious urban transformations ever attempted.
Dr. Chalier wanted to know where they'd come from and found out that in 1867 the attic of a pharmacy had been cleared out and these remains had been found.
Near the Place de la République, a pharmacist was clearing his shop's attic before demolition, when he claimed to make an extraordinary discovery. Jars filled with bones, a textile fragment, and a lid inscribed with a message: the remains of Joan of Arc. The Catholic Church took an immediate interest.
The Roman Catholic Church had the remains examined to see whether they could tell whether they were Joan of Arc's. They sort of accepted that they were, but it wasn't a definitive conclusion.
The clergy took the remains to Chinon for safekeeping, where they eventually landed up in the local museum.
So these relics were then left on a shelf for nearly 150 years until they were rediscovered by Chalier.
Chalier had little evidence to work with. A broken piece of human rib, a fragment of vertebrae from a spine, the end of a cat's thigh bone, a curious scrap of fabric, and what looked like lumps of charcoal. He faced one of his most difficult investigations, and he'd need a crack team if he was to solve the case.
It's a bit like CSI, a crime scene investigation, using a whole range of different experts, many different methods of analysis to determine whether, in this case, relics belong to Joan of Arc.
Yes, it was interesting to study these bones, which were absolutely black and that could have been burnt.
The blackened bones instantly reminded Chalier of the history lesson every French child learned in school.
Joan of Arc is a peasant girl, and she emerges out of nowhere, really, of almost total obscurity, and erupts onto the historical scene in the most unexpected of ways. She starts to hear voices, and these voices are those of the saints. The voices tell her that she is the Virgin who will save France, and that her mission is to ensure that the true King of France, who is the Dauphin Charles, will become crowned.
It was 1422. France was in the grip of a power struggle with England. That went on so long, it became known as the 100 Years' War. The French King Charles VI had just died. The English were determined to stop his son, the Dauphin, Charles, from taking the crown. In 1429, Joan rode to the Dauphin's court at the fortress of Chinon. She told the French prince of her quest to defeat the English, hand him the throne, and restore peace.
We don't know exactly what she told the Dauphin in secret. What was the sign that she gave which convinced him and many of them that she was the true Virgin who was going to save France?
Whatever she said, it worked. Joan became his military advisor. She was just 16 years old.
She seems to be quite willing to adopt the role of a warrior. And this is very unusual. She is someone who seems to be able to take on military command. She bears a banner, a standard, which is her emblem and symbol.
She thwarted the English armies in battle and saw the Dauphin crowned King Charles VII of France. But a year later, in 1430, in the midst of a battle, Joan was captured by pro-English French troops. Then betrayed by her king, who refused to pay her ransom. Charles VII knew she'd become a dangerous liaison. The church was convinced the voices she heard weren't the saints, but the devil.
She is no longer worth supporting. He must not be seen to have owed anything, least of all his kingdom or his crown, to somebody who is accused of being a heretic.
Joan was imprisoned. She refused to renounce the voices she heard, certain they were the word of God. The church wasn't impressed.
She confuses and disconcerts her interrogators. She treats them in what they regard as an extremely disrespectful way, telling them that they can't have an answer now, they have to wait for a fortnight because her voices will have spoken by then and she will then be able to communicate God's message to them, which, if the clergy are not part of that communication with God, is heretical.
A show trial found her guilty of heresy, and there was no leniency in the sentence.
The normal punishment for the heretic who is obdurate and refuses to recant or abjure their heresy, which is the dreadful, dreadful punishment of burning at the stake.
On the 30th of May, 1431, Joan was tied to a stake above a pyre of wood in Rouen market square. A vast crowd was said to have gathered to watch the spectacle. The pyre was lit. It took 3 attempts to burn her body to ash.
What was remaining of the poor girl, was deposited as ashes into the River Seine. It was highly important that there should be no relics left.
"575 years later, Chalier gazed at a labelled jar. It said, 'Remains found under the pyre of Joan of Arc, Virgin of Orleans.' Could her body have survived the fire? For Philippe Chalier, this was the opportunity of a lifetime to examine relics rumoured to be France's most famous daughter. As a pathologist who'd analysed anonymous human body parts found by the police, Chalier knew one diagnostic test reigns supreme.
DNA analysis has been described as being the silver bullet to all questions, particularly in the past.
The double helix, DNA, was Chalier's best chance of proving the bones were Joan of Arc. A molecule found in all animal and plant cells, DNA is encoded with vital genetic information, passed down from one generation to another.
If Chalier could actually get preserved DNA out of the human remains, it would be possible, one, to determine the sex of the person represented, and two, to compare the DNA profile with living descendants.
Chalier knew DNA could last in human remains for hundreds, even thousands of years. So he sent bone samples to forensic genetics experts. If the remains were female, he planned to obtain DNA from her relatives alive today to identify a genetic link with the relic bones.
DNA analysis has really been around only about 25 years for looking at archaeological skeletons. 1989 was the first time DNA was extracted from bone.
Chalier awaited the results. If the bones were male, it'd mark the sudden end to his quest.
Would have been a male, we would have concluded that these remains were absolutely not these of Joan of Arc.
Then Chalier got the call. It was bad news. The scientists had failed to extract any DNA. His plan to test her relatives for a genetic match now lay in tatters. The reason why there was no DNA was a mystery. But was it possible intense heat, like a burning pyre, could have destroyed it?
So there are two reasons why the DNA wouldn't have survived, and that would be that it didn't survive full stop, or that it was destroyed. It's very unlikely to get preserved DNA out of bone that has been cremated.
Chalier suspected high-tech science might not give him the breakthroughs he'd need to crack this cold case. To unravel the mystery of the relics of Joan of Arc, he knew he'd have to think outside the box. He had a radical idea, something never attempted before. And he'd need one of France's most highly trained noses.
I am a perfumer, I create perfumes, I smell so many things in life, and I have a passion for nice odors like flowers, fruits, spices, woods, etc. And suddenly you have someone calling you and say, "Oh, hello Jean-Michel, I am a doctor, I work in a hospital, and I am investigating on the supposed relics of Joan of Arc. Can you help me?"
I wanted to use noses of perfumers, which are professional noses and quite artistic one also, in order to smell these remains and to know if they have been burned or not.
To smell the relics, to see if there's evidence of burning, I think is wonderful. Use any test you can.
The sense of smelling is really about detecting molecules, volatile molecules that are here in the air. Sometimes quite a few molecules are enough to be detected. They come into your nose and your nose captures them and sends an olfactive information to your brain.
Like a sommelier's palate for the complex taste of wine, Jean-Michel Durier's senses were finely tuned to sniff odors with precision. He'd be the first to put the smell of the relics under scrutiny. He met Charlier at the hospital laboratory. Some of the bottles hadn't been opened for at least 30 years. Charlier hoped the scent would be concentrated enough for a result.
We were just, placing our nose on the bottle very carefully, as if also, this dead person would be still alive and we don't want to bother her too much. So, excuse me, madam, but can I smell your burnt bones? That was a bit strange.
Durier sniffed the blackened 10-centimeter long rib fragment.
Knowing the history of Joan of Arc, I was expecting maybe to smell a burnt odor. And I was surprised because I didn't smell anything burnt.
There was no trace scent of fire, but Durier did detect a faint but dense aroma, evidence that the relics were old. Scent is made of molecules called notes, which have different weights. Top notes give the strongest smell, but they're so lightweight they evaporate away in minutes. Bottom notes are the heaviest scent molecules, lingering for hours, perhaps even centuries.
What we call the top notes are the volatile notes, were completely disappeared. So what I was smelling was more into what we call the dry down or the bottom note, very heavy and soft type of note.
And the bottom note smelled curiously of vanilla.
I am smelling a sort of vanillic note. Is that possible? Is that any possible that a burnt bone can smell like vanilla?
A vanilla scent was an important clue. It's linked to the sweet smell of bodies as they decay.
Vanillin is in direct relationship with decomposition and putrefaction. So these remains are still continuing their decomposition and putrefaction process.
But the smell of decay didn't rule out that the body had been burnt on a wood pyre. The relics could still be Joan of Arc.
Just because there was a smell of vanilla doesn't necessarily mean that the body was not cremated, because cremated bone can degrade following the cremation.
Charlier needed to check if the bones had been burned, to look for direct evidence of exposure to the intense heat of fire. But to see it, he'd need X-ray vision. He called on radiologists to put the relics through their CT scanner, normally used to analyze living bodies, organs, and tumors.
It's an X-ray technique. It produces slices, which are images through the object or the body, and then those images are then reconstructed into a 3D picture.
Charlier wanted to scan the bone fragments from different angles to generate a 3D model of the bones, revealing the inside and the outside surfaces in minute detail. And he had a clever idea how to identify any evidence of burning on the relics.
Dr. Charlier did have control samples, particularly from victims of burning, so that he could actually compare what he saw in the relics with the modern victims.
The body is cremated on public places or in a car, in a private place. It's much more close to Joan of Arc death process.
Charlier would check both the relics and modern bones for cracks in their structure, created when bones are exposed to temperatures above 70 degrees Celsius and the bone's collagen starts to disintegrate.
What we wanted to know if these women have been burnt with the identification of little fractures or trauma.
The 3D models were generated on screen, and Charlier had his answer.
We saw that there were absolutely no cremation sign on the screen.
The results suggested the relics had not been burned, but Charlier wondered if the Joan of Arc legend could explain why. It takes half a ton of wood and 5 hours to cremate a body. And the history book said it took 3 attempts to burn Joan of Arc's corpse. She died in the first fire, probably from carbon monoxide poisoning, but the flames had not destroyed her body.
The body was quite intact. Only the extremities of the fingers and toes were cremated. So the English people and authorities wanted to burn it a second time.
A second pyre was lit. Joan's arms, head, and legs were burned away, but not her torso, containing the wettest organs, her lungs, heart, liver, and intestines.
It's possible after the second burning that there was just the torso left, maybe because that's got the most moisture in it, and therefore a third burning was needed to get rid of the rest of the body.
The relic bones would have come from her torso. Charlier wondered if they could have been saved from the third fire, which finally incinerated her body.
We had two possible explanations about the conservation of little relics of Joan of Arc. The first one, that as the pyre was not on the ground but upstairs, it may be possible that some bones passed from the support down to the ground.
Could the fallen bones have been saved by the jostling crowd? Or had Joan of Arc's corpse reacted to fire just like Hindu pyre funerals and modern cremations? Had the torso exploded?
The other possibility was possible explosions of the body of Joan of Arc. We've got a lot of gas that grew inside the trunk, and the pressure grows, and after, of course, it explodes because the lungs and the ribs cannot support such high pressure.
It is a known phenomenon that bodies do explode during the burning process, so his second explanation could be true.
But Charlier's theory of why the bones hadn't burned didn't account for the radiologist's second discovery. The bones were permeated by a mysterious dark substance that had once been very hot.
To infiltrate the bone, the black substance would have needed to be liquefied, which suggests that there was some high temperature involved somewhere. Dr. Charlier had to look under a microscope to find out what was actually in it.
Charlier scraped samples of the black coating from the relics. If the bones had been exposed to fire, Charlier thought he might see charcoal particles under the microscope.
He found a lot of things, including red blood cells, vegetable fibres, a dog hair, and various other things, but no charcoal.
But Charlier's analysis did reveal the substance was a resin.
We saw that it was a mixture of organic putrefacted material and also a large quantity of pollens.
Pollen grains and fungal spores, which then gave him the result that this was actually a resin from pine tree.
Charlier knew pine sap resin had been used for millennia to preserve bodies. If the remains were Joan of Arc, had someone soaked the relics in resin to prevent decay? Charlier wanted to know if all the relics were coated in the same resin. Did it hold any secrets about where or when the bones had been preserved? So he called on a long-time collaborator at the Hospital Lariboisière, Paris. Toxicologist Dr. Joel Poupon.
I know Philippe Charlier for a long time, more than 10 years, and when he wants something, he will have it. And so he is very persuasive, and You cannot resist, in fact. For him, all is possible.
Unlike Chalier, Pupin's patients are usually alive. He looks for the chemical traces of poisoning or certain diseases in their bodies. But he can find elements in archaeological remains too. He's helped solve some of Chalier's most complex cases. But an alleged saint, permeated by resin, was a first.
All the relics, the bones were covered with a very dark substance coating. And it was very intriguing. So we wanted to know if the substance was the same for all the samples and what it was exactly.
Pupin's experiment would reveal the exact chemical makeup of the resin covering each of the relics. Were they all coated with the same substance?
They also put in 2 lots of control samples, one of which was 2 bones from modern cremations, and the other was a piece of dried skin.
Chalier demanded absolute secrecy about the case. Pupin wasn't to breathe a word.
I didn't know who were working on it, and so we were supposed not to talk about it to the press or the media.
To identify the elements in the resin, Pupin had to dissolve the samples in acid, heated to 5,000 degrees.
So you put your sample with the acid in the microwave, you heat, and all is dissolved. Not exactly the same used in your kitchen, but the principle is the same.
Then Pupin ran the liquid through his mass spectrometer, which would identify and count the atoms in the samples. Chalier wanted the results straight away.
You know, Philippe Chalier is very impatient, and especially for this kind of very important study, he wants to know very quickly the results. So he phoned me and Joël, what are the results? I need it tomorrow.
The outcome was clear. Pupin proved the relics were all coated with the same resin. But this group included the anonymous skin fragment too.
It seemed there were 2 different groupings according to his analyses. One was the modern cremations, and the second grouping was the relics and the skin sample.
The relics and the skin sample were loaded with the metals iron and phosphorus, further proof the bones had decayed, not been cremated.
So the high levels of phosphorus and iron in the relics and the skin indicates the decay process that goes on in the muscles and skin.
The modern bones had a different chemical composition. There was no link with the relic resin. Now, Chalier revealed the source of the skin fragment.
So then what Chalier said to Pupin was, well, actually, that skin sample was from an Egyptian mummy.
Chalier had sent the skin sample to test a secret idea, that the relics were coated with a resin recipe invented by the ancient Egyptians. He was right. It was a major breakthrough in the case.
The blackish mixture was, of course, bitumen and a kind of balm deposited during the balming process. These results confirmed us that we had a kind of unity. The coating was exactly the same for all the samples.
Chalier was determined to find out whether the relics could be Joan of Arc, and he knew of a test that could help him peer back into the past. Zurich, Switzerland. Scientists at the Ion Beam Physics Laboratory were world experts at dating human remains by analyzing a radioactive molecule, carbon-14.
In a way, we are radioactive just by nature. Our atmosphere, our planet is exposed to cosmic radiation, and these high energetic cosmic particles finally ends up in all living organisms, also in our body.
Carbon-14 is found in every cell in our bodies, and as soon as we die, it works like a ticking clock. Because it's radioactive, carbon-14 decays at a known rate, so scientists would count the number of the molecules left in the relic bones to tell Chalier when the person had died.
We wanted to know, of course, the datation of the relics. We wanted to know if it had exactly the same period as Joan of Arc.
As soon as we die, we can't replace the C14 atoms anymore. And at that moment, the clock starts running. And from this, we can calculate directly the age. The cleaned sample material, we first burn it to carbon dioxide, purify the gas, and then we reduce it again to graphite. And this little graphite powder is pressed into these bullets.
The bullet-like capsules were loaded into the accelerator. Chalier wanted to find out if the relics were medieval or not. But he also wanted to know their geographic origin. So he called on textile historian Christophe Moulerat to analyze the fabric found in the jar.
Philips called me to say, Christophe, I've got a fragment from the relics of Jeanne d'Arc. He wants to extract the more information possible from everything.
It'd be one of the most perplexing cases Moulerat had ever faced.
Analysing the textile was really important. It potentially can show you when it was actually manufactured, where it was manufactured, what the actual cloth was.
He had just a small scrap of fabric to analyse, which was coated on one side with the embalming resin found on the bones.
The textile was a fragile 10 centimeters length part of tissue with a blackish and brownish coloration and black formations incrusted on one part of the textile.
Moulerat wanted to know what the material was made of, then its thread count, to see if it matched medieval fabrics.
So when I study the thread, I find it's linen, but the material was very fine also, very good quality. When I make the count of the thread, I find 24 centimeters.
The fabric was flax linen with 24 threads per centimetre square, a fine fabric, widespread in Europe for the last 1,000 years. But as he looked under the microscope, something strange caught Moulerat's expert eye. He knew that from the 7th century, European thread was twisted in a Z direction, but the relic thread had an opposite twist, like an S.
The thread used to make the textile was always in Z direction, and in this textile it's S. It's opposite direction. So I said, it's very strange.
He expected a Z twist to the thread, and he found an S twist. So he had to start thinking where that textile might have come from.
There was no match with European-made fabric, but Moulerat had seen this twist before.
All the textile from the Middle East, all the material is in S direction.
Could the fabric have been exported to France from the Middle East in the 15th century? Could the strange cat femur found in the relics give any further clues? Chalier had heard that in the late Middle Ages, some people believed the devil could transform himself into a cat. They were said to be associated with witchcraft and heresy, and rumoured to have been thrown on pyres when witches were burned. At least 12,000 heretics died at the stake in Europe and America between 1300 and 1800 AD. But up to 100,000 could have been killed. Joan of Arc's death was the most well-documented of them all, but there had been no mention of a cat.
When we saw the femur, first of all, we were not sure that it was a cat, and we wanted to show it to a specialist.
Archaeozoologist Marie-Alain Patou-Matisse measured the femur.
Pat Matisse was looking at a fragment of this cat's femur. People who study human remains have an easy job because there's just one species there. So you want to know what species it is, you want to know what bone it is. You may be able to determine how old the animal was when it died. And she was able to determine the total length, if she'd have had the whole femur, from analysing it. And she decided that, on the basis of that, this femur did not come from a European domestic cat and may have come from somewhere like Egypt.
It took 4 weeks for the carbon dating team to complete their tests and to analyse the data. Chalier had a clear result.
For this specific object, we measured the radiocarbon age of 2,355 years. This goes back in the ancient times. It was from the 7th century to the 3rd century before Christ.
The bones were between 1,000 and 600 years older than the date when Joan of Arc died. The question mark that hung over the relics led to one answer. They were a fake.
These remains are not these of Joan of Arc. Joan of Arc existed, but her remains are not in the glass jar.
So we now have the final results of the analysis of these relics, that they don't belong to Joan of Arc. But who do they belong to?
The cat femur was from a large breed found in Egypt, and the fabric twist linked to the Middle East. The bones had been embalmed with a resin just like the recipe used to embalm ancient Egyptians. And the carbon date proved the person lived in late antiquity, the time of the last pharaohs. All the evidence suggested Chalier's patient was an Egyptian mummy.
If these remains are not the good one, it's much more interesting to know when it was created, from which artifact, and what was the manner of making this forgery.
For Chalier, his investigation was far from over. He was determined to get to the bottom of why this elaborate forgery had been made. Chalier had been drawn into the mystery by the handwritten label, proclaiming the relics were Joan of Arc. Could the text and the glass jars give up the last clues he needed to wrap up the case? Antique expert Robert Montaigu took a look.
The cover is still intact with an inscription on it. It's a kind of parchment, and with an inscription handmade on it. Reste trouvé sous le bûcher de Jeanne d'Arc, pucelle d'Orléans.
The text read, "Remains found under the pyre of Joan of Arc, Virgin of Orléans." The Virgin was a name Joan had used for herself in the 15th century. But the moniker had been revived by the French poet Voltaire in his 1755 poem mocking her purity. There was another clue in the glass itself. The jars were hand-blown and cut off at the base, designed in the 18th century for scientists. Perhaps not out of place in a pharmacy.
The glass jar has been broken very recently, almost 40 or 30 years ago, not before. But the jar was not dating back from Joan of Arc, but it was from the 18th century. And the inscription was very recent, but with an archaic style.
The forger had attempted antiquated writing, but it didn't fool the expert. It certainly wasn't medieval, nor 18th century, but a 19th century hand. Instead of finding the relics, Chalier wondered if the pharmacist had made the forgery in 1867, putting some mummy remains in glass jars and passing them off as Joan of Arc. But why go to all of that effort? The relics had turned up when French society was in the midst of a radical transformation. In 1456, Joan's reputation had been restored when a retrial cleared her of heresy. By the 1860s, she'd become a symbol, used by three groups who were hijacking her reputation to gain power.
One has to remember the extreme fierceness of the controversies that divide France in the late 19th century over the separation of church and state. And Joan of Arc becomes a symbol in that conflict. On the one hand, the Republicans and the Socialist Party claiming Joan of Arc as a figure from the people, triumphing over the oppressive authority of the church. On the other extreme, you have Catholic monarchists who see her as enshrining the notion of a Catholic, most Christian kingship in France.
After Joan's death, a cult in her memory had developed, and by the mid-19th century, calls were being made for her sainthood. Then her remains turned up, out of the blue.
A little pharmacist, maybe he makes a kind of false reliquary, and he presents this to the beatification process in Orleans, saying, "Look what I found in my home. Look at that. These are the remains of Joan of Arc."
The church declared the remains might be real, and they were sent to Chinon for safekeeping. In 1920, almost 500 years after her death, Joan was canonized. Later, she became France's patron saint, a revered heroine. For Chalier, the motivation to make the forgery made sense. But to close the case file, he still had to crack the last part of the mystery. How had an Egyptian mummy ended up in a Parisian pharmacy attic?
Mummies have been used for therapeutic activities since the medieval ages.
In medieval medicine, parts of mummies were used to treat various ailments, particularly associated with bleeding. One example being treatment of hemorrhoids or piles.
Mummy medicine had lost its appeal before the 19th century, but it was said the building had been an apothecary for centuries. Could a mummy have been left in the attic since medieval times? Or had the body found its way there far more recently?
I think there is probably a very strong case for saying that these Egyptian relics arrived in France in the course of the 19th century as a result of the Napoleonic campaigns. The Napoleonic wars were productive of the looting and pillaging of all kinds of sites. Mummified corpses of Egyptians were, in fact, coming into France in quite considerable numbers. There are plenty of good reasons why mummified cats, given the status of the cat in Egyptian religion, should be found among these mummified collections. These are not medieval relics.
Chalier's quest was complete. He'd identified his patient, an ancient Egyptian. The team had carried out their analysis in secret. But 1 year on, it was time to let the cat and the mummy out of the bag.
At the end of the study, when the results were presented to the press and the media, it made a lot of sound in France, and all the people, the press and the journals were talking about it.
I was really expecting Dr. Chalier to find that these relics were genuine. We had TVs, we had magazines, we had interviews, etc., and suddenly it became like yes, you know, an important information.
Chalier's extraordinary discovery made headline news, and the mummy remains were sent back to the fortress of Chinon for public display. The bones weren't Joan, but for Chalier, and his team, it didn't matter.
We've seen from this study that you can get such detailed information from the smallest of fragments. I think showed how science can help unravel mysteries of the past.
Some people were disappointed by the result of this investigation. On the other hand, I think that the simple memory of her is probably enough.
Joan's memory will remain for a very long time. The qualities of human courage, fortitude, endurance, that is really what's made her reputation. She's an absolutely exceptional, remarkable figure. The relics are far, far less important than the life story.
It doesn't change anything to the person of Joan of Arc, which is unique, which is beautiful, which is exceptional. These are false relics. It doesn't change anything to the personage of Joan of Arc.
Challier's investigation hadn't found Joan, but he had busted one of France's most intriguing myths. According to legend, he was Britain's greatest king.
The name of King Arthur resonates very deeply with the British.
King Arthur led his knights of the Round Table from Camelot, a vast, spectacular castle built on a hill. But was the legend of Camelot based on reality, or simply a myth?
It's a very fuzzy and vague place. It's glorious and it's glamorous.
If King Arthur really did exist, then the remains of his castle Camelot should lie buried somewhere in Britain. But where? In the 1960s, a team of archaeologists used the latest technology to try to prove the legend was real. They were led by Leslie Alcock, a brilliant, energetic showman who brought modern archaeology into the mainstream.
And in 1966, Leslie Alcock was one of the rock and roll archaeologists of his day.
Alcock identified a hill in Somerset, close to Glastonbury, as the most likely location for Camelot. But could he really prove it was the site of King Arthur's castle? If he succeeded, it would be one of the most important archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. The man who would lay claim to Camelot was born in Manchester in 1925. As a boy, Leslie Alcock was a brilliant student, determined to better himself both mentally and physically.
Dad seems to have been full of energy and drive. I found in his cycling diaries that he used to cycle 30 miles a day before going to school in the mornings. And you see that intellectually as well.
He won a scholarship to Manchester Grammar and then another to Brasenose College, Oxford. But his education was interrupted. During the Second World War, Alcock was posted to India, where he joined the 7th Gurkha Rifles. He became fascinated by the subcontinent's history and archaeology. He learned that the past isn't just what people write in textbooks, but often something tangible, hidden in the ground. In India, he would eventually go on to work for one of Britain's most flamboyant archaeologists, Sir Mortimer Wheeler.
The story I'm telling you is not fantasy.
Wheeler's role was quite crucial in a way. One of the newspaper reporters said if he hadn't turned into a great archaeologist, he'd have been a matinee idol.
Moreover, we can relate this evidence.
He was an amazingly charismatic character.
Which, it is agreed...
It's towards the end of his active life, but nonetheless, boy, could he still carry it on. And, I mean, terrible old goat still.
Dan was invited by Sir Mortimer Wheeler to work at Mohenjo-Daro, this incredibly important dig into the centre of the Indus civilization. And I think he was taken on for a lot for his language skills, for his ability to get on with the locals, as much for his archaeological skills.
In 1946, Alcock returned to a very different Britain to the one he had left. Post-war, with its empire crumbling, the country was shattered, hungry, and in need of a lift. A country desperate for new heroes. In the early 1950s, morale was boosted by the British expedition's conquest of Everest. And Roger Bannister breaking the 4-minute mile. Reminders that Britain could still be great.
He'd obviously used up his last ounce of energy, but what an achievement for Bannister and Britain.
But there was one hero from the past people turned to more than any other.
The modern growth of Arthur is something that happened after the Second World War, when people were thinking more about national roots, how they came to be so, and so forth.
There was a resurgence of interest in the Arthurian legends, I think primarily because King Arthur was seen as a figure who'd united his country in order to fight off Germanic invaders.
King Arthur was known as the once and future king. Legend said he would rise again and restore Britain to greatness.
Part of the story is that Arthur is not really dead. He's in the Isle of Avalon, or he's in a cave asleep, or somewhere. And the idea grew up that somehow or other Arthur would return and there would be a new golden age in Britain.
Such was the fascination with King Arthur. Post-war historians and archaeologists wanted to prove the legend was based on facts, not just myth, and that Britain's very identity was forged under the blade of the mighty king. King Arthur was supposed to have ruled in the Dark Ages, around 500 AD. He was said to have been born on the Cornish Isle of Tintagel, under the watchful eye of the wizard Merlin. The story goes that Arthur became the true king of the Britons, as only he could draw the sword Excalibur that had been set in stone. He valiantly defeated invaders who came across the sea from Europe. And in one battle, single-handedly killed 960 men.
He unified his country from warring factions. He defended it against invaders. He led a band of knights, the Knights of the Round Table, who were famous for their adventures, for finding the Holy Grail and rescuing damsels in distress.
And at the heart of the legend lies Camelot, Arthur's magnificent castle.
Sometimes it's said to have been built and designed by Merlin the magician. It's impregnable, it never falls to invaders, having several rings of walls around a central keep with great gatehouses and towers on them.
It's got to be a suitable place for a glorious king and his glorious court. So it's rich, it's towering ramparts, it's horses which are clad in marvellous armours and people in beautiful robes, all being very gracious. It's a fabulous place.
But separating the legend of Camelot from real history was almost impossible. because people weren't writing about events in Dark Age Britain. In fact, there were no history books at all. So there's no record of King Arthur or Camelot at the time. The first mention of Arthur was not until the 9th century, 300 years after he was supposed to have lived, in a book called the Historia Brittonum.
Historia Brittonum told a story about a historical Arthur who conducted a series of battles against the Anglo-Saxons and emerged from these battles as the great victor. The Arthur of Historia Brittonum isn't a king. He is given a title, Dux Bellorum, which just means the battle leader or war leader.
However, there is no mention of Camelot in the Historia Brittonum. But academics reasoned that a great war leader must have led from a great castle of some kind. Camelot the castle doesn't appear until the 12th century, when a writer called Geoffrey of Monmouth first mentions it, as well as King Arthur's magnificent Round Table. He depicted Arthur's court as a place of chivalry, where the king treated all knights as equals.
Geoffrey of Monmouth concocted his History of the Kings of Britain. This has its centrepiece the life and career of King Arthur. It's the first place where, for example, his wife, Queen Guinevere, is mentioned, his fabulous court, his amazing weapons.
Thanks to Geoffrey of Monmouth, the legend of King Arthur and Camelot was born.
The idea that Arthur had a great castle as his court became increasingly inextricable from the legend of Arthur and his knights, who could now be seated around a round table in a magnificent castle.
But because the King Arthur of legend existed in the Dark Ages, not the Middle Ages, when the texts were written, there was no way of proving through recorded history alone that he actually lived. In fact, because recorded history was so scant, it was not until the 20th century that archaeologists began piecing together the story of Dark Age Britain, after the Romans had left, a time of supposed chaos and barbarism. The idea formed that maybe archaeology could offer answers where the history books had failed. And just maybe, the remains of King Arthur's great castle could be found, buried deep beneath the ground. It became one of the century's great quests of popular archaeology. When Leslie Alcock was growing up, one of the first to pioneer the new search for what was now being called Arthur's Britain was archaeologist Raleigh Radford. For 5 years, he excavated around the ruins of Arthur's legendary birthplace and what some believed had been his castle, the Isle of Tintagel in Cornwall. What he found were pottery fragments from half a world away. Fragments that completely contradicted notions of the Dark Ages. Incredibly, these fragments were from storage jars that once contained the luxury goods of their day, like wine and olive oil.
The importance of the Mediterranean pottery is it actually showed links with the late Roman world. To have this material suddenly coming in and recognized as being from dated contexts in the Mediterranean, it was a bolt of light.
Radford's pottery showed that rather than being chaotic, leaderless, and isolated, some Dark Age Britons were actually very different.
Raleigh Radford, with these fragments of high-status pottery, was demonstrating that far from a lapse into barbarism, a break with Rome, Roman traditions, Roman civilization and culture had still been continued by the Britons in the face of the invading Saxons.
Radford's discoveries raised the extraordinary question. If Dark Age Britons were trading in luxury goods, who would they have been destined for, if not a king or leader of some kind? Could Tintagel have been a receiving port for a leader in the west of Britain, where King Arthur supposedly reigned? Because of Radford's pioneering work, excitement grew that maybe King Arthur really had existed, and that archaeology might even turn up something with his name on it. Perhaps the mighty sword Excalibur, or the remains of the Round Table, maybe even Camelot itself. Among those profoundly influenced by Radford's discoveries was Leslie Alcock, who in the 1950s was an assistant lecturer in archaeology at Cardiff University. On his first major dig, Alcock stumbled across the Dark Ages, almost by accident.
He started digging at a site called Dinas Powys, just outside Cardiff, and he did that as a thinking that he was going to be dealing essentially with an Iron Age site.
To his great surprise, Alcock was able to prove the Iron Age hill fort at Dinas Powys had been reoccupied in the Dark Ages, 1,000 years later. Alcock's excavation sparked an interest in post-Roman Britain that would define his career. By the 1960s, he became fascinated by new technology and techniques in archaeology that he believed might get to the bottom of the King Arthur myth once and for all. And what better way to start than finding the site of Arthur's legendary castle? But in a country with dozens of claims to be the original site of Camelot, working out where to dig was the biggest challenge of all.
For Dad, archaeology started very much before the digging. And what I always found was he was always looking in what was written. So much is taking the writings, which the historical record, and trying to find out if the historical record is true, or the places talked about in the historical record, can we identify them?
By examining every mention of the castle in the hundreds of stories that had been written about King Arthur, Alcock gradually picked out the main candidates. In the Middle Ages, Geoffrey of Monmouth and the Romance writers had said that Camelot lay in Caerleon in Wales. But that was thought to be based on the presence of a Roman amphitheatre that looked like a giant round table. Another possible candidate was found in Malory's Morte d'Arthur, published in 1485.
Sir Thomas Malory tried to ground his version of the Arthurian legends, and he's very clear that Camelot is at Winchester.
Malory's theory was based on what was thought to be King Arthur's Round Table, which hangs in the Great Hall in Winchester. Carbon dating has in fact shown it was made for King Edward I, 700 years after King Arthur was supposed to have existed. But it was the writings of John Leyland, antiquary to King Henry VIII, that really piqued Alcock's interest. In 1542, Leyland wrote that a hill next to the village of South Cadbury in Somerset was the location of King Arthur's Camelot.
Leyland quite specifically dismisses all other candidates for Camelot except for Cadbury. He picks up the camel name from the local village names, Queen's Camel, places like that. Leyland sees in these very steep slopes and the ramparts there and the material, he gets almost orgiastic about how marvellous and how brilliant it all is.
Leyland said generations of locals had called the hill Camelot, a fact that had even drawn the attention of Alcock's mentor in India, Sir Mortimer Wheeler.
They said that their tradition was, they'd been told by their fathers and their grandfathers that King Arthur used to resort to this place, and it was known as Camelot or Camelot. That's the only real evidence we have, a local tradition. It's quite possible, I won't say more than that there is a little element of truth in this.
Local author Geoffrey Ashe, who had written several books on King Arthur, was so convinced that Cadbury could be Camelot, he approached Raleigh Radford, asking him to dig the site.
Cadbury is big. The enclosure at the top is 18 acres. Raleigh Radford was very much interested in Arthur, but when I asked him, could we excavate Cadbury, his response was, it's too big, I wouldn't know where to start.
But then Radford changed his mind, thanks to the findings of a dog walker on the hill at Cadbury, Mary Harefield.
She would go up there to walk her dog. The dog's name was Caesar. And she would walk about in ploughed-up fields there and poke about with the ferrule of an umbrella, which is the most elementary form of archaeology.
Mary Harefield turned up fragments of pottery that she thought was unusual and presented it to Raleigh Radford.
Mary Harefield's fragments were almost identical to Radford's finds at Tintagel.
Raleigh Radford, who had a vast experience of excavation throughout the West Country, immediately recognised as what he called Tintagel ware. High-status tableware, high-status storage jars, fragments, from the Eastern Mediterranean.
So oil, wine and other luxuries had been sent up from Tintagel to Cadbury for someone of high status, exactly at the time that King Arthur was supposed to have lived. And these weren't the only clues that made Alcock and Radford want to excavate what could have been King Arthur's castle. Cadbury had clearly been fortified at some time, its banks ridged with earthen ramparts, possibly to protect a large army, just as Arthur was supposed to have led. And it was located just 11 miles from Glastonbury, with its Arthurian associations, and would have been on the front line in battles with invading Anglo-Saxons pushing west. Even the Ordnance Survey map used to call it Camelot. Radford, Alcock, and Wheeler staked their reputations on discovering Camelot at Cadbury. Failure to find it wasn't an option. In 1965, the Camelot Research Committee sat for the first time, tasked with the excavation of South Cadbury. Sir Mortimer Wheeler agreed to be president, offering advice from afar. Wheeler compared their quest to the late 19th century discovery of an ancient city, also thought to be entirely fictitious, until archaeology had proved otherwise.
One of the things which Sir Mortimer Wheeler was very, very keen to stress was that it was possible for archaeologists to discover legendary locations. He said if Heinrich Schliemann could find Troy, then why shouldn't English archaeologists be able to find Camelot?
The man who had started the search for King Arthur at Tintagel, Raleigh Radford, was the committee's chairman. The last surviving member of the committee today is Arthurian author Geoffrey Ashe.
Well, I was co-founder and I was secretary. I was the one who wasn't actually an archaeologist. I kept the minutes and things like that and handled the correspondence.
Leslie Alcock was the final committee member, selected as the outstanding Dark Age archaeologist of the day.
Leslie, because of his reputation as an excavator and his knowledge because of Dinas Powys, as well as his wider archaeological knowledge, was invited to come on board and appointed as Director of Excavations.
Unlike Radford, Alcock was undaunted by the scale of Cadbury.
I think it was the challenge of South Cadbury, which is what appealed to Leslie. It's a time of big projects. The BBC were digging Silbury Hill for the first time, and South Cadbury was going to be, if he got the money, a big project.
But on a hilltop of 18 acres, working out just where to start digging was in many ways more of a challenge than digging itself. Alcock was pioneering in his early use of geophysical surveying in deciding where to excavate.
It's often said that Leslie Alcock was one of the rock and roll archaeologists of his day. He was actually at the cutting edge of the white heat of technology. He used every technological means at his disposal to make sure that when they finally got picks and shovels out, they were digging in the right place.
Di Morgan Evans was a young supervisor on the search for Camelot, who was tasked with using the new technology.
One of the clinches there was the use of what became called the soil anomaly detector, and rather than calling it SAD, it was called the banjo.
17.
It looked like a banjo. It had a round disc at one end and a box at the other, connected by a long metal pole.
25.
What you had to do is you laid out 20-metre grids and you walked along calling out measurements at every few intervals.
31.
These were then written down by somebody. It became really repetitive, boring. It was awful.
But it wasn't just advanced technology Alcock deployed to work out where to dig. He was prepared to humour some of Geoffrey Ashe's New Age beliefs.
I use dowsing, sometimes called water divining, but it needn't be only water. It can detect other things. Leslie very generously allowed me to do it. Now, I think this was brave of him because we were working with the media breathing down our necks, and it could so easily have been made ridiculous to say that they're digging with dowsing rods.
Back at base, Alcock began to analyse the data from his geophysical surveys. He could tell the site was originally Iron Age, but could it have been reoccupied and refortified at the time of King Arthur? The banjo readings seem to suggest so. there was only one way to know for sure.
When you're faced with a mass of preliminary evidence, there's only one way to resolve the problems and to sort it out, and that's to excavate.
But a dig of this scale needed a lot of money. The Camelot Research Committee had to somehow raise £15,000 to finance the excavation, the equivalent to almost £250,000 today. However, the committee knew just using the very word Camelot was guaranteed to get people's attention. In America, Camelot the musical had been the biggest show on Broadway. President Kennedy's Inner Circle had been named after Camelot. The name Camelot was on everyone's lips, capturing imaginations on both sides of the Atlantic.
Using the name Camelot was incredibly significant. Leslie Alcock was very keen to popularise archaeology, and the idea of King Arthur and Camelot might lead to an appreciation of history in these dark ages was important to him as a democratic way of explaining to beyond the elite of academia exactly what he was digging up.
With donations from the BBC, the Pilgrims Trust in America, and an exclusive deal with the Observer newspaper, finally the committee raised enough to begin the dig. But none of the archaeologists knew that one of the committee had personally taken a huge financial risk to ensure the excavation could proceed.
We were aware of the money constraints we had to spend. Leslie at times would get very twitchy, which doesn't surprise me because I only learnt later on that he, at one stage, he'd actually put up his house as security.
Leslie Alcock was a brilliant manager, a brilliant organiser, and considering the troubles he was up against, he was a very courageous man.
The dig for Camelot took place on the top of the hill and on the southern side, where a major trench was dug from top to bottom.
It was a time of really quite high tension because there was a need to deliver. It was a funny mixture of excitement, tension, and it used to come away absolutely wrung out and feeling like a wet dishcloth at the end of it.
Alcock's team catalogued all their discoveries. And hopes were dramatically raised when someone found an artifact in the shape of a letter.
All the letters that had to be in the alphabet, it was the letter A, and that, of course, caused huge excitement at the time.
The A had to stand for Arthur, surely proof of Cadbury's claims to Camelot. Alcock was so pleased with the find, he persuaded Sir Mortimer Wheeler to come and see Arthur's brooch. But after careful analysis, the A is discovered to be a Roman brooch, dating from before the Dark Ages. It couldn't possibly be Arthurian. Despite the setback, Alcock's team pressed on, their morale boosted by regular appearances of Sir Mortimer Wheeler.
He said to Leslie Alcock, "Dig there." Alcock dutifully did dig there and found things. Sir Mortimer was quite right. But he had an instinct by then, you know.
Alcock's other great mentor and collaborator, Raleigh Radford, would regularly visit the dig to check on developments.
Radford was sort of almost an amateur archaeologist in his own way, as a gentleman of independent means, although he was taken very seriously in some ways.
Raleigh Radford was an inspiration to a whole succeeding generation of archaeologists, and not surprisingly, Leslie Alcock started digging at a lot of the sites that Raleigh Radford had first drawn people's attention to.
Another regular visitor to the site was Alcock's son, John.
I think South Cadbury was just very special. When you looked at the side of a trench, you're talking layer after layer of history. There's my dad standing beside saying to me, well, that's the medieval layer, that's the Dark Age layer.
The dig for Camelot was getting huge publicity. After 6 weeks of excavations, Alcock appeared on the BBC to explain their progress.
Well, we've now reached the end of our work in 1966, and both the traces of buildings that we've found and the finds particularly give us every reason to believe that we've got a good site here of the 6th century AD in particular.
By now, interest in the dig had spread beyond Britain. Alcock needed to raise more money for further excavations and was given a huge boost by an unexpected source.
One evening, I was at home, the telephone rang, I picked it up, and the voice said, "This is Warner Brothers, where was Camelot?"
Camelot, the Broadway musical, was being turned into a major motion picture, starring Richard Harris and Vanessa Redgrave.
They wanted this for the film, you see. They were going to put a map in the film. So I said, it was in Somerset. Well, of course I said that. That's my one contribution to Hollywood.
For Leslie Alcock, Hollywood's interest was another great marketing opportunity.
You're talking about a time when Camelot had come out, when the Arthurian legend was a fascination to everyone, and my dad saw that by pushing that side of it, that this could be Camelot, he would get money to do the serious excavation. And what's more, by going to America, he could tap into a much bigger market with more money.
In the summer of 1967, the search for Camelot started up again. Thanks to the film, the committee raised enough funds, principally from America, to continue digging for another 3 summers.
Well, it's the time when flowers are coming from San Francisco. You've got Sgt. Pepper and Lonely Hearts Band. It's sort of the hippie era. It was all high degree of interest, and with the television cameras and the newspapers, and that it was all very, very buzzy.
The dig for Camelot went on for a further 3 years. As it drew to a close in 1970, Alcock made 2 extraordinary breakthroughs. His team found a late Roman coin of Dark Age origin, buried in the fortifications, that proved that the ramparts dated almost exactly to the time Arthur was supposed to have existed.
The eureka moment, if you like, where they realised that there was some substance to the legends which had got them digging, was discovering that this wasn't only an Iron Age Celtic site that maybe some Saxons had lived on top of, but in the actual Arthurian period had been fortified, had been turned into an actual castle.
And if it was a Dark Age castle, who was to say it couldn't be Camelot? But then Alcock made an even more remarkable discovery: the remains of a great hall. A hall littered with Dark Age pot shards, almost certainly used for banqueting by a great ruler at the time of King Arthur. Maybe even Arthur himself.
At South Cadbury, there was a gigantic hall, a hall at least 20 feet across, that could easily have fitted something of the size and scale of the Round Table at Winchester, for example.
It was proof, surely, that Camelot lay at South Cadbury.
Here was my dad saying, actually, I'm the guy with the physical evidence. I've got the great big hall. You know, I've got something that is far more likely to be Arthur's Camelot than anything anyone else has found.
If the castle was surrounded by Dark Age fortifications and contained a great leader's feasting hall, it seemed King Arthur really could have ruled from Cadbury.
Are you yourself convinced that these were the defences of King Arthur himself?
Well, in my most cautious mood, I would only go this far to say that if it isn't Arthur himself, then it's another great military leader so like him that it doesn't make tuppence of difference.
Alcock and his team were triumphant. They basked in the knowledge that they had shown the legend of King Arthur and Camelot to be real after all. But, little by little, doubts about the dig at Cadbury started to emerge. Academics began to question Alcock's methods and his evidence.
There's nothing at South Cadbury which would make one believe that there was an Arthur in the 6th century than one did without it. In terms of finding evidence for a historical Arthur, it completely failed.
Every generation of archaeologists challenges those that went before it. They challenge their assumptions and they challenge their findings. That's the discipline of archaeology.
Believing that a war leader called Arthur led the Britons in their heroic defeat of the Anglo-Saxons in the 6th century is akin to believing that an Englishman in a dinner jacket called James Bond defeated the Soviet Union in the late 20th century.
The evidence for King Arthur's great hall on Cadbury was highly dubious at best, they said. It wasn't big enough for a round table at all.
It gets called a Great Hall, but to be honest, it's actually quite a small hall. An awful lot is placed on the shoulders of a really rather modest building.
Not only was there no archaeological evidence, even the historical texts which Alcock had based his research on were questionable, to say the least. The new skeptics dismantled the written foundation stone of Alcock's Arthurian claims. Rather than being a history, they said, the Historia Brittonum, which first mentioned Arthur, was a work of 9th century propaganda and had its chronology of the Dark Ages all wrong.
David Dunville's work in the 1970s completely discredited most of the evidence that Alcock and others supporting the idea of a historical Arthur had used. Obviously, this had a pretty negative impact on the credibility of Alcock's work.
Some hinted that Alcock had committed historical heresy. He had tried to give credibility to works of fiction rather than establish the truth. Even the very idea of Arthur, the heroic Briton, battling invading Anglo-Saxons was misconceived, they said.
Since the 1970s, the relationship between the Anglo-Saxons and the Britons has been increasingly reassessed, and we would now tend to think of that relationship as much more complicated and nuanced, if you like. Instead of continuous warfare and hostility, some Britons and some Anglo-Saxons lived peacefully side by side.
By the end of the 1990s, no serious historian dared associate the Dark Ages with a real King Arthur again, including Alcock himself. He had the great sense, rare among myth hunters, to accept that he was probably wrong.
I'm not aware of my dad taking criticisms hard. He always saw there was another argument. He always had some doubts as to whether Arthur existed. He always was prepared to accept there were other sides to the argument.
Despite his mistakes at Cadbury, in 1973, Alcock became the first professor of archaeology at Glasgow University and excavated Dark Age hill forts in Scotland with huge success. Alcock's legacy was not only furthering our understanding of Dark Age Britain, but also the lasting impact he had on the archaeologists he taught.
Without a doubt, Alcock's work encouraged an interest in Dark Age archaeology among a succeeding generation of archaeologists, most of whom are active today.
Leslie was a great teacher, a great academic, and I think he deserves more recognition than probably he gets. And I think in due course his contributions will be fully recognised, not least amongst the sort of the hundreds of students that he trained and sent out into the archaeological world.
You can't underestimate Leslie Alcock's contribution to the world of archaeology. This was a remarkable step change in the way that archaeology and the public interacted, and it's a legacy that we're still living under.
As for South Cadbury, the hill fort is now barely even signposted. Home just to cows and walkers, its association with King Arthur, once again, buried deep beneath the ground. And although he may not have found Camelot, Alcock had discovered the fortified remains of a great leader.
We certainly didn't find the Camelot of Romance as you found it in the Middle Ages. We did find that the hill had been a great fortified place at exactly the right time.
And we now know South Cadbury Hill Fort was one of Britain's largest and most significant ancient settlements, occupied for 4,000 years, from Neolithic times until the Middle Ages.
Leslie Alcock's excavation at South Cadbury was, in many ways, a great success. It found an outstandingly useful sequence of occupation from a British hill fort.
And where does that leave the legend of King Arthur? Was he just a myth, after all?
I personally think that Arthur did exist, that as a Dux Bellorum he was a great military leader. Where he was, when he was, I can't be sure.
I think we can say that there was a real person. He is called King of the Britons.
Every nation needs its foundation myth, and Britain's is the legend of King Arthur and Camelot, a legend that lives on.